to PA Centered, a podcast designed to help listeners be a part of the solution to end sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. Each episode, we will take on a topic or current event to help spark conversation and break down barriers to building communities free from sexual violence.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PA Centered podcast hosted by the Pennsylvania Coalition to Advance Respect, also known as PCAR. My name is Cody Henry. I'm the Communication and Policy Specialist. Today, I'm joined by PCAR's Anti-Human Trafficking Coordinator, Zozan. Zozan, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Zozan Kucukaydin. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Services Coordinator here with Respect Together. And I'm so excited to be having this conversation, around such an important issue, especially in today's world. So, thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Now, in this episode, we're going to be diving into the cost of conflict, the risk of trafficking among refugees and forcibly displaced communities. So to start us all off, how would you define human trafficking?
Sure. So human trafficking is defined as a crime where one person exploits another person, most often through force, fraud, or coercion, and they will compel that person into forced labor or commercial sex. This is why we have two main types of human trafficking, which are sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And then in Pennsylvania, any youth under the age of 18 who is found to be engaging in commercial sex is considered a victim of sex trafficking, regardless of whether force, fraud, or coercion is proven.
Okay, then. Is there any difference between trafficking and smuggling?
Yes. So with trafficking and smuggling, there is a difference there. So, people might think that when individuals are smuggled through an international border, that is trafficking. Or, they might attribute the idea of human trafficking to the perceived issues around the southern border in the context of U.S. politics. But we know that the issue of human trafficking spans far beyond any borders. The reality is that people are getting trafficked across all communities in the U.S. Most often, survivors of trafficking actually knew their trafficker before getting trafficked. So we know that traffickers can often be intimate partners, family members, or acquaintances. So when we talk about, who the traffickers might be, we really want to stray away from any fear-mongering of one particular group of people or creating the idea that trafficking is an issue brought on by others outside of your community, when the reality is we need to be looking into our own communities to address this issue. So, again, some might see trafficking as this transnational issue, where you bring people to and from other countries. And while that does happen, we also understand that trafficking is something we deal with across all communities, right? We see this in rural areas, suburbs, cities, and tribal lands as well. Now, regarding the definition of smuggling, while human smuggling is considered an illicit activity, the act involves transporting someone across international borders. And while smuggling can lead to trafficking victimization, such as using debt bondage to obtain labor, smuggling in itself is not trafficking. So, for example, if you hear a story of, let's say this person had a van full of migrants and brought them across the border, that driver is not a trafficker, right? They smuggled people in, and usually smuggling is a consensual agreement as well. Now, if that driver were to exploit the people in this van by saying, well, now you all owe me, and if you don't do X, Y, and Z to make the money back, then, we'll report you, we'll get you in trouble, threaten family, whatever that might be, that is considered trafficking. Again, there is often exploitation involved in the act of trafficking, right? So hopefully that distinction makes sense.
Yeah, that's a perfect distinction. And from what you said, it also sounds like human trafficking, it's not always such a violent thing as movies make it out to believe, right? Like it's more of like a long con manipulation. Does that sound about right?
Very true. So yes, while many instances of trafficking can be violent and the experiences that survivors have through these experiences can vary. So it's, we really don't want to hang on to this one idea of what trafficking can look like. And again, like you said, oftentimes there's a grooming process. That victim knows who their trafficker is. And so it's very rarely, the stranger coming out of the bushes and kidnapping you, right? And while kidnapping and issues around trafficking does happen, we really want to be sure not to, attribute the issue of human trafficking to this one set of crimes.
Okay, then. How do risks of human trafficking and sexual exploitation increase during times of conflict? And how does it affect refugees and forcibly displaced communities?
Yeah, so we know that humanitarian crises, such as conflict, war, and economic or societal collapse, create issues like human trafficking. And just quoting a book here, in John Washington's The Dispossessed, he points out that right now around the world, about 70 million people are unhoused and on the run. And by 2050, it's predicted that that number will rise to 250 to 500 million. So possibly 500 million people will be migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in just 30 years. And of course, you can attribute this to, many issues that are on the rise, state-sanctioned violence, natural disasters caused by climate change, a plethora of things. But, whether it's political conflict, natural disasters, or state-sanctioned violence, we know that these events create devastating effects on communities, and traffickers will take advantage of this. For example, we saw this with Ukrainian refugees, where traffickers literally flocked to this area of conflict, and they would lure refugees with promises of accommodation, transportation, or employment. And this is mirrored in nearly every other conflict around the world. So again, when people are placed into situations of desperation, traffickers will profit off of this. And, this is why stronger refugee protection is fundamental in reducing the risk of trafficking. Because if we can help someone get what they need, like stable housing, income, food, and other necessities, then a trafficker will not be able to step in and provide that for them, right? And then, many factors increase trafficking risks for refugees. One of them includes forced migration and everything that comes with that. So, refugees face social, economic, and political marginalization. There is the risk of victimization by smugglers, like we discussed. And then sexual violence is an unfortunate reality of conflict and war. Refugees might also feel pressure to engage in survival sex in exchange for their basic needs. They also have to navigate issues like social isolation or severe disruptions to their family structure. For example, what many families at the southern border experience with children separated from their family and caregivers, or in Ukraine, for example, where lots of men had to stay to fight while their family fled. And then, just to add, there are, of course, eligibility requirements for certain refugee programs. There's also the issue of a lack of awareness on part of refugees to obtain that proper legal protection, right? And so overall, there's this loss of choice and autonomy, which exacerbates that risk of getting trafficked. And to add to this, refugees in the US or their host country, they might also struggle with acculturation. And acculturation is defined as the psychological and societal adaptation to a new culture. So for newcomers, culture shock is a reality. And these factors of acculturative stress can have lasting effects on their well-being and their experiences of settling. Some of that acculturative stress includes issues like language barriers and housing instability. There's also a lack of transferable credentials. So, for example, my father, who was a psychology teacher in Turkey, when he came to the US, he couldn't just be a psychology teacher again right away, right? So, he had to work wherever he could to make ends meet and build up from there. Other forms of acculturative stress include social isolation, a lack of childcare resources, mental and physical health challenges exist. And then there's also this piece of cultural conflict within families, where many refugees and newcomers are largely coming from a culture of collectivism. And then, having to navigate this hyper individualistic culture in the US also can affect that acculturative stress. So, there are all of these factors to take into consideration when working with refugees or newcomers, where, we have to come in with this cultural understanding and from a place of compassion. And we think to ourselves, how can we enact culturally responsive and trauma-informed practices to support potential refugee survivors of human trafficking?
Oh my. So you said that something along the lines of human trafficking makes a profit. So it's almost like an illegal business. Is that a different way of looking at it almost?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we do know that human trafficking, if you think of it as a business as a whole, I mean, it brings in, I think, $250 billion. It's it's actually equal to drug trafficking and the amount of money that comes out of that. But, aside from that, this is purely a human rights issue. It's an issue of exploitation. And you see this across all communities, but particularly communities that have been displaced or, and instead of saying like underserved communities that have been disinvested in, these communities are more likely to experience these risks of trafficking than those who have their basic needs met, right? But we also know that trafficking happens among wealthy communities as well. For example, Jeffrey Epstein, we know that the case around that, Diddy Combs. So there are lots of different examples of how human trafficking shows up in our communities, but really this is an issue of oppression. And when we take the time to address those root causes like oppression, then that's that first step to really addressing this issue of human trafficking, as a public health issue.
Okay, then. And then you had also mentioned that it's common because almost the societal structure of like a country or something that goes through war or an environmental catastrophe.
Right. Exactly. I mean, any situation that puts individuals into that, survival mode will keep them at risk, because all it takes is for a trafficker to step in and say, hey, I know you need X, Y, and Z, and I'll provide that to you if you do this for me. Right. And then that's that first step to, getting them under that hook and that abuse. And so that's just one thing that, we like to talk about. Addressing the root causes can be really helpful here, because again, if we can provide people with the basic needs or the things that they need, then a trafficker can't step in and say, hey, I'll fill that need for you, if that makes sense.
Is there any research into or any studies done on how long the effects of human trafficking and stuff lasts on an area that's been decimated by a tragedy? Like, is it just until like the war's over? Is there like a rebuilding phase that has to happen? Is there anything about that?
Well, in a situation of conflict, let's say war, you've got lots of refugees, you've got refugee camps, you've got all of these societal issues that are present. Those things absolutely will exacerbate human trafficking. And even like, let's say there's a natural disaster and you build everything up again, sure, that might reduce the risk of trafficking in that community. But when traffickers find people that are looking for their basic needs to be met, they will absolutely step in. And so you can see that across so many different communities, even ones that have not been affected by these socially, economically devastating situations. And so because even in areas where you don't see these sort of conflicts, you still see the issue of socioeconomic issues amongst this community, where a trafficker can definitely step in and exploit folks who are in need.
Okay, then. And then what are the needs of potential refugee survivors of human trafficking, and how can advocates work to center those needs?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously there are a plethora of needs of survivors of trafficking, but overall, survivors need to be believed. They need autonomy. They need adequate support from people that they can trust. I'll try to stick to one example here. when we're talking about culturally responsive services. So let's say, you are trying to get a potential refugee survivor of trafficking connected with mental health services. So, another layer to this, especially in our work in supporting potential refugees or survivors at risk or refugees at risk, is understanding that, as much as we would love to say, yeah, like, let's get you into therapy or counseling to address this trauma, we have to understand that there is mental health stigma across all cultures, and it shows up in different ways. And that the stigma itself has many layers to it. There are, of course, practical barriers to seeking mental health treatment for refugees. That includes the cost of treatment, the level of knowledge, of access to a variety of options. And this can all be exacerbated due to that survival mode, many newcomers and refugees face, which is, why it's so important that we work together to ensure families and individuals are aware of what options are available to them. The stigmas around, seeking professional help can also be due to cultural beliefs. So, in many cultures, even talking about mental health is taboo, let alone, seeking treatment like counseling or therapy. Or some cultures have ways of dealing with mental health that exclude Western models of therapy, like indigenous practices or leaning into community and family for support. There might also be a general mistrust in these systems, language barriers, or again, the host country or the location that the refugee is staying in has effects on this. And then lastly, of course, there's this intersection of stigma with issues around race, gender, socioeconomic status, et cetera. And, particular to language barriers, one study from the Journal of Social Science and Medicine that discrimination from speaking a different language or having an accent is a driving factor that influences the level of comfort for folks seeking mental health services. And so in this case, the study supports using or referring to bilingual and bicultural services as a means of providing culturally sensitive services. So, especially if you find that the person you might be referring has had these experiences in the past, where they might have been discriminated against, you can look into, what culturally appropriate services might exist for them and simply tailor, what you can to best fit their needs. So really, our role here when supporting survivors and potential refugee survivors is to be cognizant of these stigmas and just overall these cultural, issues. And when we're talking about mental health specifically, we can think about, what we can do to help break down those barriers, such as normalizing help-seeking behaviors and increasing education and awareness for newcomers around, what services are available to them and their families, which can influence some positive change on this.
Okay, so it definitely sounds like there isn't a one-size-fits-all option. It's more of a case-by-case type of thing.
Definitely. And, when we talk about what it means to be survivor-centered, it really comes down to what does that survivor need? And according to what they tell you they need, right? So overall, our work in supporting survivors of trafficking and particularly refugee survivors comes with plenty, to consider. But at the end of the day, survivors need someone who they can trust and someone to help navigate their healing journey the way that they see fit, right?
Absolutely. All right, so that is all of the questions that we have for you. Is there anything you want to drive home one last time or anything you want to add on?
Nope, I think that's good, but thank you again for having me. And, of course, I'm always available for anyone who would like to extend this conversation or if they need a specific training around supporting potential refugee survivors, I'm always available. So thanks for having me.
Thank you again for being a part of it.
Any views or opinions expressed on PA Centered by staff or their guests are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of PCAR or PCAR's funders.